All right, well, welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed whatever it was that you just ate. This is the Adding Style with CSS Jumpstart alongside Helen Zhang. I am Christopher Harrison. And we left off taking a look at how to go in and lay out our page and position everything. And one of the things that you did, which I thought was really neat, was that when you resize the browser, all of those boxes kind of just automatically fell right in and went from there. So, you know, I'm thinking that it'd be nice to just have your entire, page do things based on the browser size, based on the device size, so that way when somebody does open it up inside of a desktop or inside of a phone, that we'll be able to kind of see the whole thing and have that scale properly. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very highly requested item for us to cover. So yeah, appropriately, we're going to talk about media queries right now. Okay. So media queries are, one of those things that it's been around for actually a long time. I mean, media queries have been used to just format pages, basically, for printing. If you've ever noticed, even back in the day, if you printed a page and it looked different than from when you were looking at your screen, that was already a media query.
Okay.
Yeah, but now there's obviously a lot more to media queries.
Right.
So today we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to cover how to query for different screens and different devices, as well as different screen resolutions, different aspect ratios. And we're also going to talk about, how do we change up content on the page or reflow the page based on those parameters. So that all is done in CSS, and there are, of course, ways to do, responsive web design in things that are.
There we go.
Sorry. I could tell I was being signaled for something, but wasn't quite sure what. Now I know. Yeah.
Thank you, Barry.
But yeah, so what was I saying? Oh, yeah, there are other ways to do responsive web design. The meta viewport tag, for example, is something that is used quite commonly, but we're going to cover just media queries in CSS.
Okay.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to query for basically different screens and different devices. And when we do that, I want to first cover what are some good media queries? What are some good examples of media queries? Why do we need them? So I have two examples that I wanted to show you guys. The first is a list apart. This is actually a pretty great website if you're just in general interested in web design and want to read some great literature on that. So this is basically an online web magazine on web design. And you can see right now that our screens are pretty big. Maybe you can't see that, but you can actually see a lot of content on this page, and you see that the text is quite large. But they do account for when you're scaling down the page. So you can see my window's maximized now as I am making that page smaller. You see that the image up top, this header image, is gradually changing in size as well. And it's a subtler change, but the text size is actually also going to change right when we hit this break. And you'll see that this issue number, which is, very cute, but not exactly necessary on the page, also disappears alongside this ad.
Nice.
Yeah.
And it automatically shows up down below that little the issue number 409 then slides down there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the page content is reflowed quite nicely. Everything is a bit smaller, and yeah, I know that a lot of this, such as this text down here, as well as this text up here, looks like it's being cut off. That's actually just their stylistic choice. You'll see even when we're maximized, it's potentially hidden a little bit behind the bar.
Okay.
Nice design choice. So yeah, so that's one instance of what a media query could look like. The Square website, that very famous payment processor, is also incredibly beautiful, and they do really great responsive design with media queries. So you see this is just the full page right now, and I want you guys to pay attention to a couple of things when we're resizing. One is, a couple of these things are first this contact support and log in up here, as well as actually this banner for World AIDS Day. So you'll see when I make this page smaller, things are reflowing as you might expect. But when we hit this break right here, actually these icons change to be much smaller, perhaps better touch targets if you're on a mobile device.
Yep.
And some, I guess you would say, more extraneous text is also being reflowed down here. And you'll also see when we scroll down the page that a lot of these items are now aligned in one column, whereas before they had multiple rows depending on the size up here. And these are actually similar to or perhaps same as the inline blocks that we were using before. These elements are great because they do reflow for you, so you don't need to do anything special for that. You can of course choose to size them down, size the text down, things like that, but I mean in terms of the blocks flowing down the page, they'll do that on their own, which is great.
That's cool.
Yeah, so these are, I thought, two really great examples of what really awesome media queries could look like, and ideas for what you might be able to do or want to do with a media query. But let's actually get on to how to create a query. So a query is composed of a couple of things. The first is the media type. The second are media features, and then there are also logical operators. So I know this sounds very vague. I'm going to go into examples of each one. Don't worry. I just want you to have an expectation of all the different things that are involved in a media query. So the first thing are the media types. So there are a lot out there. There are the standards that we expect, like all, meaning all screens, to print, meaning what we talked about before, page that is for printing, to screen, which is a computer screen, and speech, which is a speech reader. And these are the ones that are the most commonly used. But in addition to that, there are a bunch of other things. There's Braille, embossed, which is for an embossed Braille printer, basically. There's also handheld for handheld devices, projection for, that's actually, projection,
yep.
TVs, and then also TTY, which I never remember what it stands for, but it is the oral helper for those who are hard of hearing.
Right.
So I bolded the ones up here, the print, the screen, and the speech, because those are the ones that people most commonly work with, and probably the ones that are most relevant, and the ones that are most supported by different browsers.
Right.
Yeah.
The one that's on that list that I always like to highlight, because people will gravitate towards it immediately when they first see it, is that handheld, because they immediately think, oh, okay, that must be what I want. The problem with handheld is that it doesn't give you a whole lot of information, that it really is designed for the older style phones, and you really don't want to use it, because just because a device is handheld doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a rich device. So we want to focus in on doing those media queries rather than going for handheld.
Yeah, and so you can, instead of just querying purely for type, there are also a lot of properties that you can query for, which end up being much more helpful in determining whether or not a device is, for instance, like a touch-enabled handheld device.
Yeah.
So some of the media features that I wanted to highlight were these ones. So again, the top, the bolded ones are the ones that you'll most likely be using more of. It's the width and the height of the page. Now, you're not querying for just one specific width or one specific height. You're typically doing a min width, a max width, a min height, or a max height.
Right.
Or you could alternatively use device width and device height, which the difference between the two is the width and the height is basically the width and height of the browser, which may or may not be actually the width of the device or the height of the device, right? Because, for instance, I could I could scale down a browser window, and I'd have a very small width and height for that browser window, but my device width and device height are still going to be large,
right?
The size of my entire screen. And you can query for things like that to know exactly what you're looking for. There's also orientation. So whether the device is landscape or whether it's in portrait view, because you might want to reflow content or maybe even turn content depending.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen one of my favorite little examples of the orientation is that if you're in portrait mode, if you're looking at a table of content, then what'll wind up happening is you'll get maybe 2 columns, and then you flip that to landscape, and then we'll automatically add in a 3rd or 4th, kind of a little bit more detail there. So kind of a neat little thing that you can do. And again, with CSS, no JavaScript involved. The moment that the browser detects that change, it'll apply that query and automatically show those columns or hide those columns respectively.
Yeah, and I really like doing things with CSS on mobile because a lot of mobile browsers aren't nearly feature compatible with their desktop equivalents.
Absolutely.
So these are just much more straightforward and much more reliable.
Yeah, one of my biggest peeves is opening up a site on a mobile device, and it takes 15 seconds for it to load up. Or what'll happen is maybe if it's like a news article, you've scrolled down, and then all of a sudden some last little bit of JavaScript fires, and then it goes back up to the top again. Yeah, the less processing that you can do, the easier things are going to be. The more that you focus in on CSS, the faster that's going to take place typically on a mobile browser.
Yeah, and there are other things that you can query for as well, feature-wise, on a device. You can query to see if it's a color device or a monochrome device. Though I really haven't seen that many monochrome devices, to be honest. You could look for resolution and et cetera, et cetera. But as I said, the top 4 are probably the ones that you're going to be most interested in. And next, I wanted to talk about some logical operators that we can use to sort of structure these queries. Because you're not going to be looking for necessarily just one thing. Mm-hmm. You're not looking for all screens or even all things of this minimum height. You might want something that's between 2 things. So one good example of this is if you have a large screen, or if you have your site, you want it to look one way for a large, perhaps desktop mode. You want something that's slightly smaller, maybe something that's like tablet size or just like half width of a browser. And you also want something that's even smaller than that, something like a phone. And it's nice when you're in that middle spot to say, I want the max height to be this, and if the max height is this and the min height is this, so if the height is between these 2 variables, I want to display this set of CSS properties. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these are very good. And I wanted to kind of drive this point home, let's look at some example queries. So the first one we have media, min width 500 pixels. This basically just says if the page or the browser is, this should be, yeah, so if the page width is greater than 500 pixels, so 500 being the minimum, it should display these things. I didn't really put any properties in here. This is just, those are the parameters.
The important part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is just how to query, and then we'll talk later on about what are some of the considerations you should put inside of that. The next is what I just talked about, when you set a min width and a max width. So basically, if the page width is now between 700 pixels and 960 pixels, what should you do? Mm-hmm. And I guess this is a good point to say. I mostly use min width because that is overwhelmingly the best indicator of sort of someone's screen size. Because to tell you the truth, even sort of device width is sometimes finicky and not always supported. It's not always reported accurately. It's not always reported. But min width, it's the width of the browser. It's pretty, not foolproof, but it's close.
Yeah.
And if someone is resizing your page, there's still a reason for that, and you want to refill content appropriately. So that's why the min width is there. And you'll notice that I don't have sort of a media type on there. And so if you don't have a media type on there, that just applies to sort of all media types. Whereas in this third example, I have media screen and not device aspect ratio 4/3. So that says as long as this device is a screen, so self-explanatory. If it is basically a screen and the device aspect ratio is not 4:3, so if it's not sort of the old school monitor size, then apply these properties.
Right.
Whereas the bottom one is media screen and device aspect ratio 16:9 and 16:10. That's so these would just query for these 2 aspect ratios, and it would get it would apply only if the aspect ratio is 16:9 or 16:10. So widescreen devices,
right?
For instance. And so, I mean, these are just some of the common queries you might consider using. I think the device aspect ratio ones are not as useful as sort of the page width ones, and in fact those are the ones that we're going to be working with, and we're actually going to add all these into the page that we created in module 3. So we're going to make our module 3 page a bit more responsive. It'll resize, the elements will resize based on your page width.
Perfect.
So one last thing is CSS importing before we get to that example. CSS importing goes hand in hand with media queries because for the only parameter that you can really put in to import other CSS files are essentially media query files. So when I say import CSS, I mean within your CSS file, you can basically call out to another CSS file and include all of those components inside. It's really important to put these in the beginning of your CSS file. That's the only place that they can go. So they have to precede all other elements. And you can import them in a couple ways. You can import them using the URL sort of function tag, or you can just do the straight string for their location. And these would just be unconditional imports because there are no parameters that we specified. Whereas for the two subsequent examples, you'll see I'm importing a basic.css for basically a print media type. And so that just uses the basic CSS only if this page is, or only if the print media query is triggered. Whereas this following one, it's importing the large screen CSS files for TV or projection media types. So if it's something like a large screen, perhaps you want to change up the CSS to make fonts larger, images larger, increase contrast perhaps. That's when you'd use something like that. So I think imports are a nice way to sort of separate out your media queries from the rest of your CSS for what your standard page should be.
Because CSS can get pretty big as it is. The moment you then start putting in, you start targeting specific device sizes, then it can just get out of control. So it's a nice way to break it down, make it more manageable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that we have covered that, let's actually get started and create some queries on our page. So I'm going to go to, let's actually start up this page. Oh man. Open containing folder, and then I'm going to open this. And this is what we left off with. So as you can see, when we're resizing the page, some things are happening. The text is reflowing itself because it's not jumping off the page, and that's because we did the max width to be 100% of the screen instead of some fixed number. But it's not really getting smaller. This page just kind of becomes less and less usable. When we get over here, the navigation breaks down even, and it's just not very pretty. Although, one nice thing is that these inline block elements are automatically reflowing themselves in a nice way that it's centered.
All right, so we've got something going well then.
Yeah, we have one thing done, several things to go. So before we get into how to style all of these different things, let's start by talking about what are some of the different breakpoints that we want for reflowing this page. I'm going to pick. So let's go over here into our code, into style.css, and I'm just going to put these in line at the bottom here. Instead of putting these in different files, because we're not going to do too many. Oh, oops, caps lock. And I'm going to start off by doing sort of the mobile view. So I'm just going to do if the minimum screen width is under 700 pixels, that's typically something that you consider a mobile device. There are countless mobile devices out there, but generally their width, the width is going to be somewhere between 690 to 600, somewhere below 700 pixels, and I think that's a good breakpoint. So which media query should we use? Let's go back here and and see. We have a couple of options, right? We know that these are going to definitely be screens. They're definitely going to be devices that, computer screens. So we should start with the screen. And then next, we have to pick some media features that we're going to query this on. Like I said, I'm just going to have this, so a set of features appear for if the device if the width of the window is under 700, so I can use the min device, or the min width property, or the max width property, sorry, and it's going to look something very much like this, except it would be max width, obviously. So going back here, I'm going to do screen and then max width. 700 pixels, and then I'm going to put in some properties under there, and then I'm going to give this some comments that say mobile. And then we also have that sort of middle ground that we talked about. Somewhere between a phone and a desktop, there's a lot. And so I'm going to create something for that. I'd say that most desktop pages, that something's a rather large desktop when the width is generally above like 960. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do somewhere between 700 pixels and 960 as sort of another break in our page.
Okay.
So I do sort of the same thing, media, screen, and then I'll set, so I need to set both ends. So if the min width is above 700 pixels and max width is 960 pixels. And I'm going to set that. I did something bad, because it's not syntax highlighting in a way that I want. Is it this? What did I do here?
Space. Screen space.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It might have worked, but it didn't look like it would work, and that's always a worrying thing. And this is going to be sort of our medium sized. That's not super descriptive, but I think it'll go a long way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave these empty for now because I want to talk about some of the considerations that you want to make in resizing your page. So that would be deciding and styling content. The first thing that we do want to do is decide on our breaking points. We've already done that. If we've already done that, we want a certain look for devices that are probably handheld, something with their width being under 700. We also want something for like a medium-sized device, and then our default look will be for basically your standard issue website on a large screen, on a desktop, something like that. Some of the important considerations we need to do when we're scaling down is we want to optimize our text. Our text size right now is pretty huge. It's definitely heading sized, but as you're scaling down, the devices are smaller, the resolution is already higher, but you don't need something that's that large. So we're going to want to scale down our text size. And in the same way, we want to scale down our image size as well. Mm-hmm. We only really have one image in there, but I want to scale that down to be smaller and smaller. And actually, if it's a really small device, I don't actually need to see that CSS3 logo. Yeah. I thought it's nice. It's something to, take up some space on the page, but it's not strictly necessary, right? And it's all about sort of finding out what is actually necessary to keep on the page. Mm-hmm. So let's say that's not necessarily to keep on the page. We can just hide that element at some point. And something else that's important is, adjusting your touch targets. We don't have too many touch targets in here, but something that we saw, for example, in the on the Square site is as you're scaling down, instead of having text buttons, they switched that down to sort of an easy touch target image button. And it might be nice to actually increase the touch target size on those elements as well, so that if a user is clicking very close to it, you know that they probably want to click that element, and then you'll use that as a target as well. It's just nice things to add in that you don't really need to add in for large devices. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would actually kind of dovetail off of that with two real quick things. Number one, on the image, that keep in mind that if you hide it, that display none on CSS, the image is still sent down. And unfortunately, making an image dynamic isn't as easy as it should be. There are a couple little tricks that you could use with CSS, like a background image, or there is eventually going to be an HTML5 picture element that you can use so that you can detect the device size and choose whether or not you actually want to send the image down. But keep in mind that if you just simply say display none, it's still sent down. Now for our conversation, that's fine, but real world, it's something you might want to keep in mind. And if I can mention, again, going back to another MVA, we actually did an MVA on targeting mobile devices. And so we actually have a full conversation about things like, touch targets, implementing touch, and then also going in and showing off the different ways that you can change image size based on the device and only send down the right sized image for a phone, for a mobile device.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, in fact, something we're going to talk about later, CSS preprocessors, that can help a lot as well.
Yes.
And the import statements, right? So if, for instance, if you're only importing a certain CSS style or certain CSS style sheet over to the page for mobile, and you're importing another one for sort of desktop sites, then as Chris said, you can use sort of like the background image as a URL and to get specifically the image that you want. For our purposes, we're just going to do a pretty simple, hey, when the page resizes, the image gets smaller. And that's something that's just useful. And the last is to use relative sizing. So relative sizing is something that we already put into our page right from the get-go. We had just as a reminder, we had margins of sort of 10% on the left and the right. And you mean when the page scales down, that 10% is going to get smaller and smaller. So we won't be having this like fat 100 pixel border on each side, for instance, when we're on a tiny device. So that'll actually get smaller and be sort of relative to the device size. And that's something that is incredibly useful to have. As well as what we talked about before, having those inline elements that automatically reflow themselves. So useful for if you're creating something that needs to be seen on multiple screens.
Yep.
So yeah, with that in mind, let's actually go through and add in some of these things to our media queries. So over here, let's actually start by doing our smallest screen. So the mobile/phone size. When it gets to be 700 pixels, and let me actually open this up so we can see, one nice thing about sort of developer tools is that when you put it up like this, once I get this page sort of sized in a way that's not uncomfortable. Oh man.
It's so nice just usually having dual monitors here.
Yeah.
So you just toss that off to the side.
Never mind, I'm going to pin this back. But yeah, you can, you can actually see, it's not happening on this computer for some reason. But you can usually see, there's a way to get this to happen. I can't do it quite right now. To actually see the width of the page, right now. Do you know how to get that showing? I thought that was automatic.
The width of the...
Yeah, usually it shows up. Or let me try this. Yeah, it's not showing up right now. On my other computer, it showed up sort of as a, hey, this is 700 pixels right now type thing. But that's okay. Roughly when we know that, a page is this small, we don't want an image there. We don't need an image there. That's not necessary, right?
Right.
So we can just completely hide that image. And we'll just use a selector for it. It is this CSS image ID tag that we used up here. So I'll just do CSS image. And I'll do a simple display none to hide it. And you know what? We actually probably also don't need this side text. We can just, have our title and that be it. So we can also just hide our side text in the same way.
One thing that's worth highlighting as Helen is putting in the CSS is you're going to notice that all that she's doing is taking advantage of that inheritance. because when she goes in and she sets up that media, that's now going to more explicitly define those elements. And so that's now what's going to take precedence. So rather than going in and having to redo everything, she's just going in and targeting the couple of properties that are necessary for that device size, modifying those, making those what it needs to be, and that's it. So you're not going back and redoing a brand new CSS file from scratch.
Exactly. And that's also the nice thing about including it in here, is you can see those differences. Exactly. So okay, so I have those two things. But one thing that actually also bothered me is that when the screen gets to be this size, these don't sit very nicely. And to be honest, I mean, the link to the MBA course is much more important than either of our Twitter handles.
Hey.
I'm sorry. I know.
I have like 2 followers on Twitter, and one of them is my mother, and I don't really think that counts.
I'm the other one, right?
Yes, and Barry's the other one.
I'll follow you on Twitter if you let me just hide both of us.
All right.
Okay.
Fair deal.
Yeah. So as you can see, a lot of what I'm doing right now is basically just hiding stuff. Because once you're on a smaller screen, you need to really know what is important on the page, what you need to show, and what you can sort of get away with hiding. So we're going to hide our names, and we don't really have, actually, if you look at the code for this, we don't really have specific classes for our Twitter handles versus this. It's kind of the same thing, or it's the same type of attribute. But what we can do is we can use the pseudo classes, as we talked about before, to just hide the two of our handles. So what I'm going to do is sort of the same selector as I did before, header, and then list item descendants of that. And then I'm going to do the not, which I think was briefly brought up. These are just basically, if it's not whatever is in here, then it'll be true, right?
Okay.
It just negates it. So I'm going to hide everything that's not the first child.
Okay.
Because if you look on the page, the first thing on the list is the link to the site, and then everything else is just our handle. So I'm going to do not the first child, and then I'll say display none for that as well. Don't worry, I'll do other things besides display none. I know, right now it's kind of just the same thing over and over. But yeah, I'm just going to hide everything that's not the first item of that list.
Yeah, but that display none is very important, especially when you get into that print. So doing things like just hiding all of those images, hiding the navigation, all of that's very important.
Yeah, exactly. And one last thing I'm going to do is this text is huge. I don't think I should hide it up there, but this is basically 3 times the normal size. It's 3 EM originally, and I'm going to make it something manageable, like 1 EM, like the size of general text on the page, especially since it's a smaller screen. And how did I define that? I think I did. I'm going to check to make sure. Banner text is just an ID. Perfect. So I'm going to do banner text, and I'm going to set that. I'm going to set the font size to just be 1 EM. And then now when I save this and I refresh this little guy. Oh, did I save it? Maybe I'm not on the right page. That's embarrassing. Demo.html, this is style.css.
Just do a real quick Control F5. Sorry, inside of Visual Studio. Because what that should do is then reopen up the browser for you.
All right. Well, let's. I'm going to think about what could be going wrong right now. Media screen max width 700 pixels. That should be fine. Yeah, display none is a pretty straightforward property. If it's showing up, it should show up.
Go back to the browser again. And yeah, just and do a Control F5 on it just to make sure. Because I'm wondering if maybe something is cached, and then shrink that down.
Interesting, interesting. Okay. I'm going to check something. I'm going to check what it's supposed to be. See if I did anything wrong. I did. That's embarrassing. I think I forgot this and here. And maybe that'll fix it. Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
I forgot the and.
That's the demo blow up graphic.
It's not the worst thing. That's why you have the backup knowledge.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so now that you're on a smaller screen, the text is much smaller. But that's a pretty drastic jump that we did to go from this page to this with basically no transition in between. So what I'm going to do is actually flash out this part, and then I'm going to do this and right here. That way that doesn't blow up. And I'm going to add the properties here that we talked about. I'm going to just be lazy, copy a lot of these things over, because these are the elements that I still want to change. Maybe not these. I think our names will stay up there for something of this size. We're that important, right? So it's all about progressively removing elements, and we're not there yet. We don't need to remove ourselves yet. Okay. Yeah, yet. So for the CSS image, instead of just doing display none, I'm actually just going to shrink it down a little bit. I'm going to change its width and height. So before it was, I think, 300. Now I'm going to do maybe 150, something half the size of its original. And for the side text, let's see what I had before. For side text, I had font size 1.5 EM before, and maybe now I'll just do 1 EM. And then for banner text, instead, I don't want it the same size as my font, so I'm going to actually up that back up to 2 EM, so it's twice as big, and that still looks like a header text. I'm going to save this, and then when I go over here and I refresh, I'm going to drag this out too. Okay, so this is between the 700 pixels and the 960. It'll look like this. As you can see, this logo is quite a bit smaller than this original, and so are both of the texts. They're both significantly smaller. So now when you're going from a page of this size to a page of this size, you get something that's smaller, and then when you go even smaller, smaller, and smaller, you have that sort of progressive degradation of the page.
That looks really slick. I like it.
Yeah. There are sort of two schools of thought about doing these things, and the one that I just did is, start with a fully fleshed page, decide what to take out as you go smaller and smaller. But of course, a lot of people also just choose to do the opposite. They look before they build a page, or as they're building the page, they say, "Hey, what are some of the most important elements on that page?" And they sort of build for that, that small mobile screen first.
Yep.
And then they sort of say, well, what else can I add? What other information can I add until they get to a larger and larger screen?
Right.
And that's also great as well. I think one good example of this that I saw was a weather app. When you're on the smallest screen, you want to basically just show, hey, what is the temperature outside? What is the weather like? And then as the screen gets bigger, you can say, this is the humidity outside, this is the chance precipitation.
There you go.
And things like that. And then as you go full on page, and you add like a background image. And I think that's also a really great way of thinking about designing your site as well. It depends on the type of site that you're building. If you're building something that's pretty full content, you maybe want to start big, go small. If you're building something that's more like a small lightweight web app, you can start small, go big.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts you have on media queries?
No, the only couple of things have really just been around images in the chat window. And again, images is just one of those really tricky things. The one little tool that I'm going to highlight here, and actually let me bring up. I want. I think it's all one word. Processing. It's my little dance. There we go. Okay. Perfect. So Scott, and I'm going to mispronounce his last name. Jail?
That sounds okay to me.
Okay.
I'm not Scott, though.
Scott J has this great little tool called Picture Fill. And what this will do is it will, regardless of your browser, bring to life the picture element. And what's great about the picture element is it will allow you to identify different picture files based on those exact same media queries that Helen just showed off there. And what's important about that is because somebody asked about resizing the image, and in the case of your CSS logo, resizing that makes sense. But resizing a lot of other pictures, just simply shrinking it down, isn't really what we want. That a lot of times what we want to do is focus in on different areas. So just kind of get rid of some more of the surrounding area. So we need different files. That's where that picture element comes into play. This is eventually supposed to become part of HTML, but as anybody who's experienced with HTML can tell you, just because it's supposed to be coming doesn't mean that it's coming anytime soon or will actually happen. So this will, through JavaScript, automatically implement that for you, and it's a really slick little utility. So definitely recommend checking that out. So, and then beyond that, I think that's about it as far as the Q&A goes.
Okay, great.
So, yeah. So what do you say we take 10 minutes, and then we'll come on back, and we'll actually do two things. I'm actually going to do a real quick aside and show off columns, just because we haven't done columns yet. And I'm sort of feeling a little bad, because all of your stuff has been looking really, really good, and my little demo kind of looked a little bit cheesy. So I want to go in and kind of finish that out, throw in some columns, which is typically how you'd want something that's that much text to display. And then I'll also show off how to implement transitions and resize things as well through CSS. But let's take 10, and then we'll come on back and we'll do all that. So we'll see you guys back here in 10.